Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 52, Friends and Foes. Back in Episode 50, we saw how hostilities between Burgundy and England opened up after Philip the Good split from his allies during the Congress of Arras. But all in all, the few years of Anglo-Burgundian hostility would prove to be a blip in an otherwise generally peaceful, and if not always friendly, amicable relationship. The same could not be said of the Franco-Burgundian relationship. Philip the Good had high hopes when he signed the Treaty of Arras, but his long alliance with the English and the scars of the Civil War meant that he would always be a distrusted and feared figure at the court of Charles VII. At the same time, Philip the Good had grown too much in wealth and power to simply become a vassal of the French crown again, and that was demonstrated when he signed the Treaty of Arras as Duke by the grace of God, rather than Duke by the grace of the King, much to the chagrin of Charles VII. For his part, the king immediately regretted giving so much to the Duke of Burgundy, and in fact, when the Duke of Bourbon first returned to court after the Treaty of Arras was finalized, he was met with suspicion, as Charles thought that he was overly generous to his brother-in-law. Consequently, the king resolved not to honor the treaty whenever he thought he could get away with it. For example, several articles in the treaty deal with the king building various monuments and endowing masses and chapels to the memory of John the Fearless. None of those monuments were built, and none of the masses were endowed. Moreover, the treaty also called for the king to give Burgundy a large sum of money in compensation for the jewels seized from John the Fearless's baggage train at Montereau, as well as in settlement of outstanding debts from years earlier. And while some of this money would be handed over, the total sum would never be paid out. The king was also eager to undermine the Duke of Burgundy's influence in the territories which had been ceded to him, and this was done in a number of ways. Right off the bat, the king refused to hand over the towns of Chablis in Auxerre and Charlieu in Marcon, and these royal enclaves were only the tip of the spear. The Parlement of Paris, now back in the hands of Charles VII, would be a persistent thorn in the side of the Duke of Burgundy, and a series of lawsuits against the rights of the Duke began to be heard at the court. Just a few months after the Treaty of Arras was signed, Philip was already complaining to the king about these suits. Moreover, the Parlement also began to levy fines in Philip's territories, when in the past that right had been reserved for the Duke. We also see cases where royal officials repeatedly overruled the decisions of Burgundian officials, cases where royal officials interfered in Burgundian ducal mints, cases where royal officials tried to undermine ducal rights in Burgundian territories. We see the royal bailiff of Lyon style himself as the bailiff of Mâcon as well, despite the fact that Mâcon had now been officially ceded to Burgundy, and that Charles VII attempted to appoint a royal bailiff in Amiens, despite Amiens also being ceded to Burgundy. These issues were all minor in isolation, but put together they paint a picture of a king trying desperately to claw back whatever he had ceded at Arras. However, there was one more issue at hand which proved to be the most dangerous, that of the Ecocheurs. Although we have not specifically dealt with the Ecocheurs before, we have dealt with very similar groups, such as the Free Companies which arose after the Treaty of Brittany in the 14th century. The Ecocheurs were the scourge of peaceful society, unemployed mercenaries. Up until the Treaty of Arras, the Ecocheurs had been who I've been talking about whenever I referenced the independent mercenary companies harassing Burgundy on its various fronts. But even though the companies were now no longer being sponsored by the royal court, they had a good thing going on and did not want to give up their lifestyle. Some of these companies did find employment in other fronts of the 100 Years' War, but most turned to banditry and pillage, both in French and Burgundian lands, albeit mostly in Burgundian lands. The Duchy of Burgundy itself was hit especially hard, as were Picardy and Hainaut. But all throughout northeastern France, and even beyond it, the Ecocheurs spread chaos. So the raids continued as the royally sanctioned mercenaries transitioned into Ecocheurs, which, by the way, is French for Skinner. Enguerrand de Monstrelet claims that this name originated from their practice of stripping their victims of everything save for their shirt, so that when these victims returned home naked, their neighbors observed that they had been skinned. However, I could also see it stemming from their general level of ruthlessness and savagery. I also feel the need to point out that there was a revolving door of sorts between Ecocheur and royal soldier. Campaigns would be launched and Ecocheurs would be hired, but whenever that campaign ended, the men would return to raiding. The demobilization of royal armies thus became a fraught affair, and as these armies disbanded, the nearby populace held their breath. The Ecocheurs will continue to be a problem for years, so we'll have to get used to them. As with the free companies, the bands of mercenaries tended to agglomerate and coalesce into armies, and about a dozen or so of these armies ended up wandering around France and Burgundy, causing devastation wherever they went. Both Charles VII and Philip the Good were prevailed upon to do something about the Ecocheurs, but for the most part, all the king did was either go, "Hey guys, no, don't," or subtly encourage them to raid Burgundian territory rather than French lands. As for the Burgundian response, Richard Vaughan writes, quote, "Every means was tried to rid the duchy of the Ecocheurs. Aids were levied to purchase their withdrawal. Armies were mustered and marched against them. The frontiers were patrolled, and towns which could be persuaded to admit ducal troops were garrisoned. These measures were carried out with patience and vigor, but very limited success." The depredations of the Ecocheurs soon became one of the principal Burgundian grievances against the king. Richard Vaughan argues that the continued raids of the Ecocheurs in Burgundian territory were part of a deliberate royal strategy to weaken Burgundy. And while I do think that theory has a lot of merit to it and is mostly true, I also just have to wonder about how much Charles could have done to protect Burgundy from the ravages of the Ecocheurs if he was inclined to do so. And I would guess that the answer would be not much. But whether or not Charles was deliberately using the Ecocheurs to attack Burgundy, there certainly was the perception that he was. When not referred to as Ecocheurs, these soldiers were often called les gens du roi, or the king's people. Furthermore, in the court of Philip the Good, there was a real fear that the raids of the Ecocheurs were just the first stage of an invasion of Burgundy. Despite these fears of a possible French invasion, and the very real faction in the French court calling for one, Charles VII's policy with respect to Burgundy was one of deliberate irritation and pushing boundaries, rather than one of outright aggression. And there were moments when things didn't look so bad for the Franco-Burgundian relationship. In 1436, the Duke became the godfather of one of Charles's sons, and in 1438, the king agreed to marry one of his daughters to Philip's son. But even the marriage agreement would not be free from discord, as the king parted bitterly with his daughter's dowry, more so than he parted with his daughter. Tensions rose and fell as the princes sent each other gifts and friendly letters, or demands and complaints. One of Philip's main weaknesses was that his influence at the court of Charles VII was limited. There was a large number of anti-Burgundian voices at court, but relatively few pro-Burgundian ones. The loudest pro-Burgundian voices tended to be Philip's brothers-in-law, the Duke of Bourbon and Constable Arthur de Richemont. But Bourbon was finding that his own influence at court was falling at an alarming rate, and Richemont tended to confine himself to military matters. The dominant faction at Charles's court at this point was the Angevins, the family of Queen Marie of Anjou. Charles had grown up with Marie's family, and her mother, Yolande of Aragon, was more of a mother to the king than his own had been. The Angevins had always been influential, but ever since the fall of Georges de la Tremoille, they were ascendant. Charles of Anjou, the Count of Maine and younger brother of the Queen, became the king's new favorite, and other ministers with ties to the Angevins rose to prominence. If you recall, the houses of Burgundy and Anjou had some bad blood between them, and that was not helped by Philip's imprisonment of René of Anjou, brother to the Queen, and the king's new favorite. René was not freed as part of the Treaty of Arras, much to the king's annoyance, and when he was released from captivity in 1437, the terms were punitive. Hugh de Lannoy had suggested that Philip should release René without a ransom to build up goodwill with the king and those closest to him, but the Duke of Burgundy was feeling vindictive. In the end, Philip gained little from his power over René. When the Angevin prince was captured at Bourneville, the Duke of Burgundy had high hopes. He thought that he might be able to appropriate the Duchy of Bar for himself, and the Duchy of Lorraine for his ally, Antoine de Vaudemont. He thought that he could gain leverage over the royal court, and he thought that he could gain a fat ransom. In any event, Bar and Lorraine were a bust, and by releasing René of Anjou, Philip alienated many of his allies and supporters in the duchies. As for leverage, the Duke of Burgundy may have gained some, but he was never able to use it effectively. Philip did manage to extract a large ransom, but only a fraction of it would end up being paid, and in 1445, under pressure from Charles VII, Philip forgave the outstanding debt. Still though, it was too little too late, and René would not remember his time in Burgundian captivity fondly. Philip had the opportunity to make René a friend, but instead he cemented the Angevin prince as an enemy. Philip could at least rest assured that René's wrath would not be immediately directed against him, because once the Angevin prince was released from Burgundian captivity, he made his way to Italy to stake his claim to the Kingdom of Naples, the now decades-old ambition of the House of Anjou. He would be back in France after a few years, as he had no more luck in establishing Angevin rule in Naples than his brother, father, or grandfather, so we'll circle back to good King René in a future episode. Now I want to briefly explore the later career of the man who had seized the county of Guise away from René of Anjou, John of Luxembourg, Count of Ligny. The years after Arras were not easy ones for John of Luxembourg. The Count of Ligny found himself isolated in the aftermath of the Treaty of Arras and the Burgundian about-face. His family was closely tied to the Lancastrian cause, and he felt honor-bound to continue in English service. On a few occasions, Philip the Good tried to force the issue and summon Luxembourg to fight with him against the English, but John always found some excuse not to show up. As Luxembourg's unwillingness to follow Burgundy across the lines became apparent, tensions arose between Philip the Good and the man who had once been his leading commander. Things came to a head in 1438 when Philip attempted to levy a tax on some of John of Luxembourg's territories. Luxembourg himself did not try to resist this tax, but the people who lived in the hinterland of his town of Am did. They declared the tax to be too heavy and appealed to have it rescinded. However, the Duke of Burgundy did not appreciate this attempted snubbing of his authority, and sent a company of archers to collect the tax by force. As the Burgundian archers arrived in the area, they began raiding in order to collect the tax. As they marauded through the region, the people fled to Am and appealed to the garrison of the city to protect them. The commander of the garrison, Jacotin de Bethune, agreed and saw off the archers. According to Bethune, he thought that the archers were really Ecocheurs, and when he learned that they were in Burgundian service, he stopped the fighting. However, it was too late, and the archers were fleeing back to the Duke. Philip the Good was not impressed, and demanded that John of Luxembourg hand over the commander of the Am garrison. But Luxembourg refused and stood by his man. Over the next few months, it seemed like a complete breakdown of relations between Burgundy and Luxembourg might follow, and who knows how things could play out. Philip's resources were vast and far greater than Luxembourg's, but John of Luxembourg was an experienced commander, he controlled a number of well-defended castles, and he had an army that could easily punch above its weight. Tensions continued to rise, and Philip seemed to want to force the issue. The Duke of Burgundy confiscated Luxembourg's lands in Flanders and Brabant, and refused to meet with him until he agreed to give up Jacotin de Béthune. However, by now, Béthune was aware that he was a wanted man, and he had fled Picardy and was no longer in the power of John of Luxembourg. Desperate for a way out, Luxembourg wrote to his friends on Philip's ducal council and his brother knights in the Order of the Golden Fleece to intervene on his behalf. These men saw the danger of alienating one of the strongest and most capable captains in Burgundian service. Not only was Luxembourg in command of a powerful army himself, but he also had assurances from the English that they would aid him if he was attacked by Burgundy. Furthermore, the Ecocheurs were still ravaging the region, and Luxembourg's army was a key part of any resistance to them. Hugh de Lannoy, Nicolas Roland, and Jean Chevreau, the Bishop of Tournai, all appealed to Philip to receive John of Luxembourg back into his good graces. They brought up not only the military necessity of doing so, but also Luxembourg's long career as a loyal Burgundian servant. After a good deal of cajoling, Philip agreed to pardon Luxembourg as well as Béthune. Luxembourg spent his remaining years away from the Burgundian court, but no longer necessarily on the outs. His army continued to be a bulwark against the Ecocheurs, and he spent most of his time fending off raids from both the Ecocheurs and the official French royal army. After all, he was technically a traitor. John of Luxembourg died in January of 1441 without ever swearing to the Treaty of Arras. He had no children of his own, and so left everything to his nephew, Louis of Luxembourg, the Count of Saint-Pol. Now, not everything ended up going to Louis, as some of the territories which John had gained over the years of conflict broke away or were confiscated by the French crown. But between what he had inherited from his father and his uncle, Louis was a powerful and rich lord. However, Louis of Luxembourg was now facing down the might of the French crown, as Charles VII seemed determined to force the Count of Saint-Pol, and now Ligny as well, into submission, before he got any ideas of following in his uncle's footsteps. Several commanders, both officially in the royal army and Ecocheurs, were sent to besiege Louis. Saint-Pol saw no way out and submitted to the French king. Some territorial disputes would be put to the courts for judgment, but Louis was, for the most part, allowed to inherit John's lands and accepted into the French court. While John of Luxembourg's life was one defined by loyalty, the same cannot be said of Louis of Luxembourg. This Count of Saint-Pol will have an interesting and chaotic life, which we'll be able to further explore in the episodes to come. Now, let's briefly return to Hugh de Lannoy's advice to Philip the Good in late 1436. The central thesis of that advice was the dangers of remaining at war with England and the necessity of peace, both the particular peace between England and Burgundy and the general peace between England and France. Hugh outlined a number of strategies that the Duke could use to achieve the particular peace and influence the French court so that they would be inclined to support the general peace. One such strategy was to release René of Anjou without a ransom, and that was duly ignored. Another strategy was for Philip to return the Somme towns to the king in order to induce him to grant Normandy to the English, and that was also ignored. A third strategy called for the Duke of Burgundy to try and arrange the release of the Duke of Orleans from English captivity, and in this case, Philip agreed. Charles, Duke of Orleans, has not appeared in our story for quite a while. But if you recall, he was a major figure in episodes 23 to 29, from the assassination of his father, Louis of Orleans, to his capture at the Battle of Agincourt. Charles of Orleans was just 21 when he was captured by the English, and so by 1436 he had spent half his life as a prisoner. The conditions of his imprisonment were not especially harsh, but even so, the long captivity took its toll. Fortunately for him, the Duke of Orleans had an outlet: poetry. He wrote in both French and English, and his work is some of the finest late medieval poetry in both languages. He mostly wrote love poetry, but his desire for peace and his desire to return home were also common topics. And furthermore, it's very possible to read the latter into his love poetry. For example,
En songe, souhaite et pensée, vous vois chaque jour de semaine. Combien qu'êtes de moi lointaine, belle, très loyalement aimée. Pour ce qu'être le mieux paré, de toute plaisance mondaine, en songe, souhaite et pensée, vous vois chaque jour de semaine. De tout vous est l'amour donné, vous en pouvez être certaine, ma seule dame souveraine. De là, cœur moult désiré, en songe, souhaite et pensée. In dream, wish and reverie, I see you every day of the week, even though you are far from me. Beautiful one, you are very truly loved. Since you are most blessed with every earthly pleasure, in dream, wish and reverie. I see you every day of the week. I have given you my love absolutely. You can be certain of that, my sole lady, queen, much desired by my tired heart, in dream, wish, and reverie.
Charles of Orleans' long captivity was in part caused by his political value. The Duke of Orleans was a prince of the blood, second in line for the throne behind Charles VII and Dauphin Louis. In his last will and testament, Henry V instructed his son's guardians that Orleans and the other major prisoners should not be released while his son was still a minor, unless it was part of a permanent peace deal. And thus, as he could not be ransomed otherwise, the best hope for the Duke was for a peace deal of some sort to secure that freedom. Over the years, the Duke of Orleans took part in a number of schemes in the name of peace, one of which we will be covering in the next episode. For the most part, these failed because both Orleans and the English overestimated the influence which the Duke held at his cousin's court after all these years of separation. But that's not to say that Orleans had no influence, and there was a significant faction in France, especially among the grandees, who wanted the Duke to come home. And, moreover, there too was a significant faction in England that favored the release of Orleans in hopes that he would help to negotiate a favorable peace with France. So as the Duke of Burgundy was looking to make more allies in France, he looked to the captive Duke of Orleans and thought that here too was a prince in need of allies. Moreover, it seemed that both princes stood to benefit from an end to the 100 Years' War, Burgundy to secure his lands and ensure commerce, and Orleans to secure his freedom. Or, as Hugh de Lannoy put it, quote, "Thus, if the King of France were to place difficulties in the way of a general peace, the bastard of Orleans, and several captains who are close friends of my Lord of Orleans, as well as his servants and officials in his French lands, could well persuade the king to change his mind in favor of my Lord of Orleans, thus facilitating the peace negotiations. On the other hand, if the English freed my Lord of Orleans, he could, in return for his release, considerably advance the peace negotiations by influencing the king and lords of France. And if his release had been effected by you, he would always be indebted and grateful to you." Lannoy was not the only person to make this observation, and in 1437 the Duke of Brittany worked to organize a peace conference and found a useful partner in Orleans. This conference was sort of organized behind Charles VII's back, and so when it was time for the conference to open, the king refused to attend, and everything fell apart from there. Now, that's not the whole story, as the Duke of Bourbon was also trying to organize a coup to oust the Angevins at the same time, but again, I'll get into that next episode. As the Breton peace plan fell apart, a Burgundian one was in the making. Hugh de Lannoy was in England in early 1438 for talks centered around the reopening of Anglo-Burgundian commerce, and while no deal was reached at these talks, they did go well enough that another round of talks would take place a few months later. Philip the Good had also now come around on the necessity of making peace with England, and so this next round of talks would not be solely focused on trade. With the Anglo-Burgundian talks going well, the Duke of Burgundy also approached the French court to gauge their interest in another peace conference. And while the response at this point was non-committal, it was positive enough to merit further preparations. Around this time, Isabella of Portugal, the Duchess of Burgundy, was tapped to lead the Burgundian delegation in their future negotiations with the English. Philip himself was still unpopular in England and was still seen as a traitor, but his wife had no such baggage, and furthermore, she was the niece of Cardinal Henry Beaufort, the leader of the peace faction in England. Beaufort was, at this point, the unofficial financier of the English crown, and his loans were almost all backed by promises of repayment through taxes on wool exports. Therefore, if he ever hoped to see his money again, a resumption of the wool trade would be necessary. However, we should not be under the impression that Beaufort only wanted peace for financial gain. He had been a promoter of peace for years now, and genuinely saw it as the only way forward for England. Isabella and Beaufort met in person in the Pale of Calais in late 1438 to organize the details of the wider Anglo-French conference which would open in the summer of 1439. During these talks, Isabella seems to have stressed the importance of having the Duke of Orleans present at the conference, and Beaufort agreed. Back in England, the Duke of Gloucester objected both to the peace talks and to the prospect of allowing Orleans to participate. But Henry VI, now beginning to take an active part in government, voiced his approval of the plan. Word, too, came from the French government that Charles VII would take part in the planned talks, and in June 1439, workmen began preparing a site on the road from the Flemish town of Gravelines to Calais. As the French delegation made their way north, they brought with them the 10-year-old Catherine of France, daughter of Charles VII and fiancée of the 6-year-old Charles, Count of Charolais, the only legitimate son and heir of Philip the Good. Catherine was dropped off at Saint-Omer, while the rest of the French delegation continued to the Pale of Calais. Also at Saint-Omer was Philip the Good. The Duke of Burgundy decided not to attend this peace conference, possibly thinking that his presence might be somewhat polarizing and could do more harm than good. But he was near enough to the goings-on to stay well informed, and he was represented by his wife, as well as some of his most trusted counselors, such as Hugh de Lannoy and Nicolas Roland. The Burgundian delegation was, in this conference, really a subset of the French delegation, which was officially led by the Count of Vendôme, but in practice was headed by Renaud de Chartres, the Bishop of Reims and Charles VII's Chancellor. Both Vendôme and Chartres had been present at the Congress of Arras, and the Chancellor, in particular, had been involved with just about every Anglo-French peace attempt of the past few years. The English delegation, like at Arras, was led by John Kemp, the Archbishop of York. Henry Beaufort was also there, but also like at Arras, was somewhat apart from the delegation proper. Both Cardinal Beaufort and Isabella of Portugal would act as mediators, and in that role they would be joined by the Duke of Orleans. Orleans had been permitted to travel to Calais, but initially he was just held there, and was only permitted to be briefly visited by members of the French delegation. There he was finally able to see his half-brother, the Bastard of Orleans, again, after almost 25 years apart. However, after intervention from Isabella and Beaufort, Orléans was granted more freedom, and soon he was invited to join them as a third mediator. None of the three mediators could really be considered neutral, but all three truly wanted peace and could be relied upon to negotiate in good faith. But even with the mediators doing their best, the issues that had come up in the past peace talks had still not been resolved, and the negotiations at Calais in 1439 really echo those at Arras 4 years earlier. Both the English and French began the negotiations with harsh, uncompromising terms, but after some posturing, both sides began to give in bit by bit. However, there were two issues that neither side would give in on, and, stop me if you've heard this before, they were who was the true King of France, and whether the English would hold their territory in France as a vassal of the French crown or with full sovereignty. Other issues, such as what land each side held and the prospect of allowing those who had fled Normandy during the English conquest back into the duchy and restoring their property, could be debated, but both sides' stances on the big issues were unyielding, just as they had been at Arras. Now, this conference would not simply be a repetition of the Congress of Arras. The English seemed willing to give in a little bit more than they had in 1435 by virtue of their weakened position, but consequently, the French were willing to give less. One interesting innovation came from Cardinal Beaufort. He proposed that Henry VI and Charles VII could share the title of King of France, and he appealed back to the days of the Merovingians and Carolingians for precedent. This proposal, while creative, was rejected outright by the French, who would acknowledge no king other than the Valois one. But, despite these stumbling blocks, negotiation did occur. Bedford was able to make reasonable concessions, and the French too were now willing to consider making a truce rather than demanding a peace, a notable difference from the Congress of Arras. After a few weeks of back and forth, a truce was agreed to for a period of 30 years. According to this deal, the English would keep Normandy and Guyenne, but would give up the other territory they still held. The exiled Normans would be restored to their lands, but they would not be allowed to serve in the French army while they held land under the English king. The thornier issues of the crown and homage would be deferred. During the truce, Henry VI would not refer to himself as the King of France, but likewise Charles VII would not demand homage for Normandy or Guyenne. And lastly, the truce could be broken, but 1 year's notice had to be given first. It was about as good of a compromise as could be expected, and so both delegations went home to consult their governments. The French court played for time, and Charles VII would not take up the issue. Evidently, he figured that the English would reject the deal, and he could thus paint his enemies as unreasonable. He was right. Like with the final deal at Arras, there was a fierce debate back in England on whether or not to accept the deal. Historian Christopher Almond found a document which recorded the debate back in England and summarizes the arguments thus, quote, "Those who favored acceptance of the French concessions and the proposal for a 30-year truce could argue that the English territories in France were poor and deserted, and that the burden of paying for the war would fall increasingly upon the English. Were they willing to bear the burden? The French, it could be pointed out, were winning with little effort and cost, since the English armies were badly looked after, being led by lazy captains whose main concern was their own profit. Moreover, the French populations were turning against the English, and trade was coming to a halt. In short, did the results justify the great expense of the war? It was the argument of realism. The counter-argument, set out at greater length, saw the problem through different eyes. To accept the French terms was to act contrary to the king's honor, and that of his house, since he had been crowned King of France in Paris, and withdrawal would mean that his French subjects had successfully disobeyed him. To abandon the royal title for the sake of a truce would be folly, for the king would not be able to exercise his royal rights again without the title, and the French king could all too easily drive him out when a suitable opportunity occurred. The question of restitution, too, posed grave problems. Restored clergy would use their great influence over the people to turn them against the English, and they should therefore not be allowed to return. And what of the secular possessors of land in Normandy? It was impossible to dispossess the large number of English and loyal Norman holders of fee noble without devising some method of compensation. The appeal to self-interest is evident throughout the argument. In the end, the nays won out, and word was sent back to Calais that the English royal council had rejected the deal. Bedford must have been disappointed, but maybe not surprised. He held out hope that the French delegation would return to Calais at the appointed time so that negotiations could continue. But when they did not show up, he again must have been disappointed, but not surprised. However, the Calais conference was not a complete failure. While the French delegation did not return to Calais, a Burgundian one did. This time, the talks went smoothly, and after a week and a half, an Intercursus, or commercial treaty, was signed. The Intercursus was initially just meant to resolve the Anglo-Flemish commercial relationship, but as it was being negotiated between the members of Flanders and the English, many of the other territories in the Burgundian Netherlands wanted to join in. And so eventually the deal grew to encompass Burgundy as a whole. This treaty, while not officially making peace between England and Burgundy, in effect ended the war between the former allies. The Intercursus established that merchants from both Burgundy and England could travel between England, Calais, and the Burgundian Netherlands unmolested, and that merchants from one country could stay in the other, that those merchants would pay the tolls of the other country when required, and that a large road be built between Calais and Gravelines, along with some other minor points and concessions. Finally, infringements of the Intercursus were to be settled not with retribution and seizure of goods, but by negotiation, arbitration, and reparation. The Intercursus was originally meant to last for 3 years, but soon after it was proclaimed, it was extended to last for 7, and then after that it would be repeatedly renewed. Thus, the relationship between England and the Low Countries returned to their natural, amicable state. In the years that followed, the relationship between England and Burgundy continued to recover, and Philip the Good was once again able to remove himself from the 100 Years' War. By 1442, most of the Calais ordinances, which, if you recall, were the series of acts that initially soured the commercial relationship, were repealed. And in the years that followed, the rest began to be phased out. So while the negotiations of 1439 were all in all a disappointment, they did end up going pretty well for Burgundy. On the other hand, no one must have been as disappointed in the failure of the general peace process as the Duke of Orleans, who now saw his hopes of freedom once more beginning to fade. But things were not all bad. During the Calais conference, Isabella of Portugal and Charles of Orleans seemed to have formed a real friendship, and furthermore, while he was in Calais, the Duke of Orleans was able to write to the Duke of Burgundy, and the two dukes also seemed to have struck up a friendship. Letters and poems were sent between the two dukes. Orleans' poetry was admittedly much better, but he had the good sense not to critique. And the princes officially quashed the bloody feud started by their fathers. Although the Duke of Burgundy no longer required Orleans' freedom in order to secure peace, after the Calais conference broke up, he seemed to only be more determined to secure his cousin's freedom. The Duke and Duchess of Burgundy repeatedly petitioned the English for the release of Orleans. They argued that Orleans could help England gain a beneficial peace deal, and that his release would be a critical show of good faith. After some fierce debate in England, where Humphrey of Gloucester, as always, argued for the most aggressive path forward, the terms of the Duke's ransom were agreed to. The ransom would be huge, but if Orleans could secure a favorable peace, it would be forgiven. After so many years in captivity, and after his lands had been ravaged by the war, Orleans' resources were stretched thin. Isabella of Portugal was the one who rallied the princes of France to contribute money towards the first payment of the Duke's ransom, and the contribution from Burgundy was by far the largest. Charles, Duke of Orleans, finally returned to France in late 1440. Upon leaving the Pale of Calais, he first traveled to Gravelines, where he was met by the Duchess of Burgundy, who escorted him to the Burgundian court. The Duke of Orleans then went on a progress throughout Flanders and Artois, where he swore to uphold the Treaty of Arras, took part in Philip's joyous entry into Bruges, married Philip's niece, Marie of Cleves, and was inducted into the Order of the Golden Fleece. From this point on, Orleans would be one of Burgundy's closest allies in France. There was probably only one person in France who was unhappy with the reconciliation between Burgundy and Orleans, and unfortunately for both dukes, that person was the king. Charles VII did not trust this new friendship and feared that it might be used against him. And when Orleans finally returned to court, he was met with a cold shoulder. The court of Charles VII was a turbulent place, and in our next episode, we'll dive into those treacherous waters. Thank you to Emmanuel Dubois from the Lafayette We Are Here podcast for standing in as my Charles of Orleans. And thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchess de Nemours, Elliot, Graf von Gravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Meursault, Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Seymour, David, Graf von Bornum, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Quentin, Graf von Blasfeld, Eric, Comte de Couche, David, Graf von Barland, Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches, Olivier, Comte d'Ussert, John, Graf von Helmond, Spencer, Graf von Breda, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com, and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.